All right, here we are back with some more Gendlin. Today, I am going to read, or at least begin reading, The Concept of Congruence, reformulated in terms of experiencing. So, again, I didn't pick this for any reason except that it's basically the next paper in the list. So, I don't really know what this is about. I don't know what the meaning of congruence is. Or like, I don't know what the significance of it is here. Like whose use of that word is he going to be talking about? I don't know. Obviously, I know this word, but I'm guessing it's Carl Rogers thing. So I have not read any of Carl Rogers directly, I don't think. Pretty much most of my exposure to Carl Rogers has been through Gendlin, I think. Although I think I probably knew about Carl Rogers before Gendlin, since he has a bigger name. So yeah, that's all I'll say. There's not much I don't know. Again, I can't explain congruence in my own words at this point, not having read anything about it from Rogers, so I'll just begin. This paper will attempt to show that the major conclusions of Rogerian theory can be supported and clarified if an addition to the theory is made. This addition, implied in the theory itself, is the function rather than the content of experiencing. Okay. So the role that experiencing plays rather than what you are specifically aware of in when you're putting your attention into yourself and experiencing. Okay. So 1. Rogers' concept of congruence. The concept of congruence is central in Rogers' theory. The basic concepts of the theory are defined in terms of congruence and incongruence. An individual is said to be congruent when the content of his awareness symbolizes all the content of his organismic experience. Okay. That's interesting to imagine, given everything that we've talked about and that I've learned about Gendlin and focusing as a process of symbolizing raw experience. When the content of his awareness symbolizes all the content. Like that almost seems like impossible from a Gendlin theoretical point of view, because focusing is a never-ending process, being a process, right? Gendlin doesn't believe in, as far as I understand, doesn't believe in there being like just a set amount of content within a person that is there to be discovered. It is a never-ending process of interaction with life and the environment. So that idea of symbolizing all the content of one's experience seems yeah, well, we'll see. It doesn't seem like Gendlin would say that that's possible. When self-experiences are accurately symbolized and are included in the self-concept in this accurately symbolized form, then the state is one of congruence of self and experiencing. Okay, so that makes me think like self on the one hand is like the conceptual part, right? Where in focusing, or the conceptual or the symbolic part, where focusing is about symbolizing raw experience, right? Giving word, giving a handle to that murky felt sense. So self seems to correspond with that side of it, the concept, the form, the handle. And experience, on the other hand, is that inarticulable or largely inarticulable, non-conceptual, implicit, raw experience, right? So congruence is when the concept matches the experience, or the symbol matches the experience, which is what you're trying to do within focusing, right? In the 6-step version, that's where you are doing that resonating back with the felt sense to see if the handle is accurate. And if it is, then it sounds like that would be described as congruence. I feel like maybe one of the 6 steps involved the word congruence, and I just can't remember, and I sound like a total dumbass. But anyway. Yeah. So self is like an articulable thing, conceptual, symbolic, and experience is the counterpart. Okay. Optimal psychological adjustment exists when the concept of the self is such that all experiences are or may be assimilated on a symbolic level into the gestalt of the self structure. Optimal psychological adjustment is thus synonymous with complete congruence of self and experience, or complete openness to experience. Either that was a difficult paragraph, or my brain is like not tip top right now. When the concept of the self is such that all experiences are or may be assimilated on a symbolic level to the gestalt. I honestly don't really know what gestalt means either, besides obviously knowing that it's a huge... I mean, there's gestalt therapy, but I couldn't tell you what gestalt actually means. Okay. They are or may be assimilated on a symbol. What does this may be assimilated? What would it mean for something to not fall into this part of that? If it may not be assimilated, what would that be? I don't know what that would mean. But it must exist because not everyone is in a state of optimal psychological adjustment. I don't think Carl Rogers or Gendlin would say that. Their whole careers were about helping people find their way to that. So yeah, that's the question. What is this? May be assimilated. So the synonymous with complete congruence of self and experience. But yeah, again, Gendlin's whole thing is that experience is always more than can be symbolized, right? It's a never-ending process. And so it doesn't seem like anything, it doesn't seem like, from Gendlin's point of view, that can ever be fully done. Right? Like in the paper Improvisation Provides, he talks about that constant give and take between form and like that which like comes up, I forget what, like bubbles up basically from underneath, right? There's always, as long as there's life, there's always going to be that other extra stuff coming up around the form, which is the self, right? There's always going to be more in experience than is contained within the concept of self. But again, maybe that's the whole point of this, right? The conclusions of Rogerian theory can be clarified if it's about the function rather than the content of experience. Yeah, anyway, so an optimally adjusted person, so defined, will experience himself as the locus of evaluation, will find his organismic valuing a trustworthy guide to the most satisfying behaviors, and will live with others in the maximum possible harmony. All available experiential data will be available to awareness and used. Interesting. Experience himself as the locus of evaluation. So evaluation, I'm guessing in that case, means like the act of giving value to things that one experiences, right? So you will experience yourself as the center of how value is given to the things that you're involved in your life, or the things that you encounter in your life. So you will be the source of that that valuing process. Find his organismic valuing, right? That is the evaluation. Organismic valuing, so your whole self as an organism, not just as a self-concept. How your organism values is a trustworthy guide to the most satisfying behaviors. That's very like intuitive eating or just somatic stuff in general, right? Somatic, I feel like it's relevant to say here that word soma doesn't purely just mean like body. Like there are multiple words in Greek for body, and soma is one of them. But soma in particular gets at the body like imbued with spirit. It's not simply material body. It's not just like matter, but it's matter imbued with living spirit. Right, so that's why like just like a purely biological, anatomical way of looking at the body, that doesn't really correspond to soma, because soma is essentially about that body living and the experience of that living body. And it's only a living body that can value things as an organism, right? That's what the like somatic meditation that I've been doing for so long, it's all about. It's like listening to your body in the deepest possible way and listening to your body as a guide in life. But specifically listening to your soma, not just I don't know, there's like a deeper meaning to that. My brain's not the best right now. Or I just feel kind of lazy about explaining myself. So anyway, that makes sense to me. Probably not to you if you're listening, but it makes sense to me. And will live with others in the maximum possible harmony. That's an interesting addition there. living with others in maximum possible harmony. And the fact that that's tied together with this thing, it's like, I guess that they're like, he's not saying this. There's nothing making me think this. It's exactly, but that they're kind of like mutually causal, right? Interconnected. That if you are valuing your organismic evaluative process as leading you to the most satisfying behaviors, that in some way that will allow you to live with others in the maximum possible harmony. Interesting to consider, like, that statement in contrast to, like, the big five, right? And whatever conscientiousness. It's like, how much do you care about, like, harmony between other people and, like, keeping the peace and stuff. Interesting to think that Roger's definition of what it means to be adjusted is to be in harmony with other people in the maximum possible way. Also, yeah, then this part, all available experiential data will be available to awareness and use, right? So that's like, I mean, if we talk about somatic stuff, and I've talked about this in other videos, but there's the example, and the body keeps the score of the really traumatized woman who goes to get massage, and she's so, her trauma is such that she's so dissociated from her body that she can't really even register where she's being touched. Like, when her feet are getting massaged, she can't actually tell you without looking where she's being massaged. It's like, okay, that's an extreme example, but in that state, she definitely does not have all available experiential data available to awareness, let alone able to be used. Right? She can't even tell you that her feet are being touched. Right? And so, for the rest of us, it's like, and again, that's like what the somatic meditation is about. In a very slow and deep way, putting your awareness into your body, in your toes, in your feet, and through your legs, like the whole way through, and developing more and more and more awareness of raw experience. And that's, again, like, such a subtle thing. You think you're aware of your whole self, and then you try to put your awareness in your big toe, and you're like, oh, there's so much that I can't feel. And then you do it for a while, and you're like, oh, wow, I can actually feel all these different parts of my big toe. And you realize how much more there is to be aware of, how much more experiential data there is. Okay. So these are all quotes too. So I have used this concept of availability to awareness to try to make clear what I mean by openness to experience. This might be misunderstood. I do not mean that this individual would be self-consciously aware of all that was going on with himself, like the centipede who became aware of all his legs. On the contrary, he would be free to live a feeling subjectively, as well as to be aware of it. He might experience love, or pain, or fear, living in this attitude subjectively. Or he might abstract himself from this subjectivity and realize in awareness, I am in pain, I am afraid, I do love. The crucial point is that there would be no barriers, no inhibitions, which would prevent the full experiencing of whatever was organismically present and available to awareness, and availability to awareness is a good measure of this absence of barriers. Oh, okay. That reminds me, that's like a really, I think that's a good way too to talk about soma, which I was trying to describe before. It's like, soma is like the subjective experience of one's body without necessarily having any reference to like objective, like this is how my anatomy is, like this is, from like a scientific point of view, like knowing the makeup of your body, like that's not what it is. It's a subjective, like phenomenological awareness of your body is what somatics is about. But yeah, to just experience what you're experiencing and not push it away without putting up a barrier to it, without being inhibited, to just experience what you're experiencing fully, right? It's not that you can talk about everything that you're experiencing necessarily, but you can experience it fully. It reminds me too that I have this thing that I guess I haven't really talked about a lot publicly, but one of the like guiding stars as far as like an idea or concept for me is the idea of spontaneity, and like true deep spontaneity, not just following one's impulse, but like a spontaneity where you're listening to your body at an extremely deep level, and you have no more barriers or inhibitions in that. And I think that is a very different thing than we normally think of with spontaneity. I think generally, from conversations I've had about this with people, oftentimes it sounds like people tend to think of spontaneity as just like being impulsive, and how dangerous that can be. Right? It's like, how can that lead to anything good? But it's definitely not what I mean, right? Like I think it takes, in a way, like very hard work or like very deliberate, sustained effort to become truly spontaneous. And I don't know that spontaneity can never be like truly arrived at. It's more like a horizontal thing, where like perfection, like it's always out there on the distance, right? Like the horizon, and you can go towards it, but you never actually get closer to it, but you do progress. So with spontaneity, I think it might be similar, where you can never arrive at it, but you can always move in the direction of it. But it'll where it is in relation to you will always remain the same. Like it'll still be out there in the distance. But yeah, anyway, that's kind of more of a note to myself. Every stimulus, whether originating within the organism or in the environment, is freely relayed through the nervous system without being distorted or channeled off by any defensive mechanism. In the hypothetical person who is completely open to his experience, his concept of self would be a symbolization in awareness which would be completely congruent with his experience. That's cool. Right, these are all quotes from Rogers, I'm guessing. Yeah. So it's cool to see him mention the nervous system, since that's something I'm studying. And yeah, I mean, this goes along with what Irene Lyon talks about a lot. I mean, she talks about following your impulses, and so it's funny that I was saying that spontaneity is not following one's impulses, but your impulses are also changeable and will be different depending on the state of your nervous system. So, but yeah, noticing your impulses at the very least is like a practice in paying attention to oneself at a very deep level because yeah, there's a lot to say about that. Uh, Listening and following one's impulses. Like she talks about following one's impulses in terms of like just basic physiological, biological stuff, right? Like how does your body, like postural or digestion or sleep and rest or exercise, like what does your body want to do without regard to what you think your body should do based on the ideas you have about how posture should be or how you should eat or how you should exercise and when you should exercise and all this stuff. It's like, what does your body actually want to do? And pay attention to that and do that, let it do that. And that develops an extreme amount of not only like conceptual self trust, but like deep biological nervous system trust because you're actually listening to yourself and allowing your organism to do what it's communicating it needs and wants to do. And the more you do that, your impulses actually change because your whole nervous system, your whole organism is sort of like readapting to like being healthy. So, like as an example, when I started practicing intuitive eating years ago, the first step of that was taking away all the rules around eating and following my impulses. And for a little bit of time, my impulses were to just eat trash. Like, I would just eat so much junk food and like candy because I had been training myself against doing that for so long. And so for months, I was just eating like tons and tons of candy and all sorts of sweets and whatnot. And then it came a point where I was like, oh, just noticed. I was like, yeah, that it just feels very empty now. Like, you know what actually sounds good? Like my body is asking me in a way to just like eat something that has like more substance to it. So it was like I just naturally started wanting to eat healthier and like wanting to eat vegetables and whatnot. And then I just began eating healthier than I ever had in my life because I was like, yeah, I don't really want to eat all that crap that I've been eating this whole time. So by following my impulses there, I went through this process of like, yeah, developing the trust to just listen to what my body actually wanted. And at first, it had all these like kind of fucked up, exaggerated wants from all the way I had been treating it and what I had been allowing it and how much I had been listening to it for the all the years before. But then once I paid attention to it and did what it was asking for long enough, it adjusted and it started wanting shit that was actually like really good. Uh, and I never had to like intervene and be like, no, I need to eat healthy. It was just like, no, that's actually genuinely what I want to do because my body wants that. So, um, yeah, so just that's the point I'm saying there is just like that process of listening to and even following one's impulses. It doesn't just like at first it can, like that's related to the whole non-coercion thing, right? You could describe that whole experience of intuitive eating as like a non-coercion practice, is like removing those disciplines that I had been trying to impose on myself for so long. And it's one of the biggest objections to the idea of non-coercion is that you'll just like fuck off and do nothing and eat crap and lay around on the couch and watch Netflix. It's like, yeah, you might do that for a little while, but after a while, if you're paying attention to yourself and treating yourself well during this process, you'll start to just like spontaneously, and again, spontaneously, this is why I am so into that concept of spontaneity, is that like when you remove all of these top down pressures on yourself, eventually you spontaneously begin to want what is good and healthy. Um, so, yeah. Every stimulus, right? So it's like your entire experience in life is allowed to move through you, freely relayed through the nervous system without being distorted or channeled off by any defensive mechanism, which is like basically a description of what trauma is like, right? Holding back tears, for example, is a very simple example that I use a lot. You have the feeling of sadness and wanting to cry, and that you allow that to happen rather than stuffing it, right? Which is like basically being channeled off by a defensive mechanism. And Irene Lyon, she defines trauma basically as a stress response that has been frozen, like stopped, and not allowed to like be metabolized by your own nervous system, right? So you like get spiked into a stress response, and then you get stuck there rather than being able to come down from it. And that stuck stress response in your body, the tensions, the chemicals, the hormones, like that is trauma, right? It's that impulse moving through the nervous system that gets distorted and channeled off and stuck, and that's trauma. So, okay. The process of psychotherapy is also defined in terms of congruence. In the process of therapy, the client's concept of self becomes increasingly congruent with his experience. Thus, psychotherapy is defined as a process of increasing congruence. Mm-hmm. There's so much there, though. I feel like I could just move on, but as I reread that sentence, that quoted bit, it's like, man, yeah, that's rich. It's like what's happening to the concept of self, and then what's happening to one's experience, right? Because part of it is an expansion of your ability to be aware of experience. So that's one side of the coin. But then there's also like what's happening to your concept of self. And in my own experience, especially like the past month with everything that we were doing in Shift 30 for 30, so much of it for me was how do I best describe, like well, I mean, I can use my Twitter name example, right? Like hugging demons. So like, or you could talk about uh, integrating shadows, right? It's like taking this thing, this like self concept, this idea, this way of being that you don't, that you're like holding away from you, right? And you thus like define your sense of self against what this thing is that you don't want. And so basically, the concept of self, by integrating your shadow, expands to become capable of including so much more experience, right? Because before, that whole experience of whatever it was that was in your shadow, to use that language, that's not part of your sense of self, and so your self is incapable of being congruent with your experience, because that whole part of your life that is a shadow doesn't fit with your concept of self. You don't allow it. Right? So as you integrate your shadow or hug those demons, or however you want to talk about it, your sense of self radically expands to allow for a greater congruence with the totality of your experience. So, one of the conditions of a therapeutic relationship is genuineness, or congruence in the relationship. Genuineness is congruent awareness of all experiences insofar as they concern a relationship. Excuse me. Thus, the therapeutic relationship, too, is defined in terms of congruence. Congruence in the relationship. Congruent awareness of all experiences insofar as they can concern. I mean, I guess it's, basically the same thing, right? Concept of self becomes increasingly congruent with experience and the experience of oneself in relationship, I guess. That's as far as I'm gonna try to understand that for now, anyway. To be genuine is to be genuine is for your sense of self to be congruent with your experience of being in relationship, I guess. Congruence is thus the most basic action of Rogers' theory. If an individual's perceptions and behaviors are based on all his experiences, then his responses are based on the fullest possible information about himself and reality. His own experience from moment to moment is therefore the best possible basis of interpretation and action. To the extent that all his experiences in awareness, the individual needs no external guidance, no stereotyped constructs, no superego. His organism is the best guide, both from his own and from society's point of view. So this reminds me too of something that I've been thinking about more and more, is in Aristotle, his ethics, he talks about the the mean or the moderate action, the epitome of virtue, basically, like right action. It's like the right action in the right circumstances, in the right way, at the right time, in relation to the right person. Like, that's what it means to be the mean and to be like perfectly moderate. And I'm realizing more and more, like, it's easy to imagine that that's something that you have to like deliberate upon and like somehow figure out perfectly and calculate. But I think more and more that that's like an impossible thing. If you're trying to calculate deliberately an action, like how to respond perfectly to the moment, that's like a contradiction in terms, because to deliberate is to be removed from the moment. I mean, deliberate means deliberate. I mean, the etymology of that, I'm not being like perfect, but it's to basically remove yourself from a freedom of response, right? Is to create this predetermined way that you're going to behave regardless of what happens, right? Based on an idea of the future and how you want to be in the future, but it's not in the moment, and it's not a pure spontaneous response to the moment. Yeah, it's like the opposite of spontaneity is deliberation. Right, so the opposite of spontaneity is to be deliberated, not free. So, yeah, to be able to achieve that perfect right action in the Aristotelian sense, I think more and more only makes sense to me as something that you arrive at spontaneously, right? Because you're fully open to being aware of one's experience and one's circumstance, and able to bring one's full capacities to the table in the moment, respond purely in the moment. And in that way, right, what you would be doing is your organism is a guide to the most satisfying behaviors. That's basically what I'm getting at, right? Is that you can't figure that out mentally, intellectually. It's like a whole organism thing to be fully aware of yourself and your circumstances, and to respond to that in the most perfect way, or the most true way. Isn't a calculated thing, but is a spontaneous thing arising from your whole organism. That is the Aristotelian. Probably, I don't know that Aristotle thought of it this way, but like that's how it makes sense to me more and more by the day, based on my own experience. That you become your own guide, but it's also you're not your own guide in the sense that your calculating mind, your deliberation is the guide. It's like you're more than that, right? You're responding as an organism that's in touch with the entirety of experience, which is a very different thing, right? That's the kind of pure, deep spontaneity that I'm getting at and was talking about earlier. Not just like a in the moment, like impulse following. So yeah, his organism is the best guide, both from his own and from society's point of view. I mean, that's interesting too, from society's point of view. That I don't know what to do with that, actually. So anyway, Roger's theory, as it stands, has raised numerous objections. Yeah, even just this part, I can see how that doesn't make sense largely within how society, or how we feel about what's allowed of us in society, right? And it's very different from like a Freudian concept of adjusting, being well adjusted is to like rein oneself in. Anyway, Roger's theory, as it stands, has raised numerous objections, some of which will be discussed in part 4 of this paper. Sorry, one second. I was writing a note to myself. So Roger's theory, as it stands, has raised numerous objections, some of which will be discussed in part 4 of this paper. I believe that the theory gives rise to these objections because it is formulated in static terms, while it implies a dynamic process. I call this dynamic process experiencing. Yeah. So that was what I was getting at before. It's like Gendlin's whole thing is that this stuff isn't static, a process model. It's always moving. It's never ending. It's not about discovering this like set amount of contents within oneself. That's a never-ending exploration of that murky edge of the life experience. So, yeah, that makes sense. I think I'm gonna stop here. I'm not feeling super energetic today to keep going. So that'll be the end of part 1, and next time we'll start with experiencing an addition to the theory. Okay. If you watched, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and until next time, take care.